What's stopping people from experiencing more connected and meaningful relationships, whether it's at work or in their personal life, it's not the lack of time, not having the right mindset, or not having better habits or communication skills. I mean, all those things are important. But what's really stopping people from having great relationships is the condition or state of their emotional nervous system and how comprehensively they're using their brain. Here's the bottom line. Whatever state or condition that your body and brain spends the most time in gets adopted as its default and made to run automatically. It doesn't matter if we're talking about muscle, fat, aerobic fitness, brain strength, thought patterns, or whether our emotional response system got locked into high gear, low gear, or that sweet spot in between. That's just how we are. That's how all cellular life is. Automatic patterns are preferred by our bodies because they're energy efficient. And that's how our brains and bodies are designed to work. But for many of us, our emotional nervous system adopted a pattern of response earlier in life that got reinforced over time, and now is either interfering with our goals, wreaking havoc in our relationships, burning us out at work, or just making us feel kind of crappy most of the time. So what we refer to as personal growth work is really about retraining our brain and emotional nervous system to spend more time in and eventually automate the operating state or condition that you'd rather be in. In other words, you want to feel differently and have a different emotional experience, but you have to have it often enough that your brain and body adopt it as your automatic way of responding. If we don't regulate, moderate, or retrain our emotional response, and we don't start strengthening underused areas of our brain, either we'll keep getting the same results in our life, or we'll keep making those initial, well-intending big pushes for change, like we all do, and then fall back into our old patterns as soon as we hit a rough patch. You know what I'm talking about, right? We'll be all motivated and start working like with a couples therapist on communication skills. Or we'll start working with a management coach at work who gives you all sorts of personality profile tests and emotional intelligence strategies to help improve your team relations. But then you keep running into blocks. You feel misunderstood, mistakenly think it's stress or the system, or we convince ourselves that this just isn't the person or the company that I'm meant to be with. I mean, it could be any of those things. But what if you're wrong? What if you've been working hard in all the wrong areas and seeing things through a sort of clouded lens? Yikes. It's a pretty big risk to take. I mean, it's one thing to make a mistake and leave a job prematurely. But making a mistake in a love relationship, that's a much bigger deal. I know that talking about brain science and nervous system physiology sounds sort of technical and intellectual, as if all we are physical, intellectual creatures. And besides, aren't we supposed to be getting away from focusing on all that stuff these days? Yes, that's very true. And there is much more to being human than just our intellect and biology. But I've found that instead of starting off with something that's more difficult to wrap your head around, like psychological theory or spiritual philosophy, I found it simpler to begin with something we all already know fairly well and are already quite familiar with: the intellectual part of our brains and the physical nature of our bodies. There are many facets or components to experiences like anxiety, depression, and even love. Take anxiety as example. That is a complex, multifaceted experience with many parts and pieces to it, right? And one of those parts is physiological in nature. So I found that instead of starting with the less tangible, more conceptual elements, all of which are very important, I found that starting with something that I know I can influence, like my body and brain, really made the other aspects so much more accessible and easier to weave in. I mean, we really do have a lot more experience to draw from here. We all know that we can change our bodies, whether it's muscle mass, a change in blood pressure, learning new skills through repetition, physiologically adapting to higher altitudes and colder climates. We sort of already know all that stuff, right? So starting you here, showing you first how your brain and body work, showing you how the state of your emotional nervous system and the way that you use your brain can impact your relationships. Starting with that is a way of meeting you where you're already at. In a way, you're not learning something completely new. You're just taking something you already know from other experiences and transferring it to a new subject. Which is why I believe a lot of people are really going to gain traction much more quickly by approaching it this way. And as less used areas of the brain strengthen, and as your emotional nervous system becomes more centered and stable, those more abstract, mental, psychological, and spiritual areas, they really start to come together. And who you really are at core, or what some people call their spiritual or core essence, it will sort of become unblocked and released. Sort of released from the constraints of our habitual neurophysical patterns. And that's where you're going to find meaning, clarity, and purpose. It may sound a bit strange, the idea that our physical state could be constraining or blocking our more non-physical state from expressing itself. But that's been my experience. So I'm betting there's more people out there who can have this experience as well. There are many pathways and approaches that ultimately help regulate your nervous system. But if you're not making traction with what you're currently doing, or you're just starting out and what I've said sort of makes sense to you, then I suggest starting by learning how these tangible physical and neurophysical pieces work. And then get your brain and body dialed in and back operating closer to the way they're designed to operate. And if that's as far as you go, you're still going to gain a lot. At minimum, you're going to feel a whole lot better from the process. And all of those other behavioral skills that I mentioned earlier, like the communication and the work relations, they will be so much easier to develop. In fact, once your emotional response threshold starts to shift, those skills won't even need to be that perfect or super high level in order to see real improvement in those relationships.